What's up everybody, my name is Justin. Welcome back to the Pit Lane Garage. You know what time it is, it's MCS suspension installation time for my 2017 BRZ. A long time in the coming. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, we have the car up in the air, the Quick Jack doing what it does best, saving me time and my back from back pain. Let's see the helper springs and the spring guides that we got. These were the parts that I was missing the other weekend when I tried to attempt the suspension install the first time and realized that I didn't have these and that I needed them, but here is what I am talking about. These guys here are your helper springs, so these are super soft springs. As you can see, they just flex right down. There's no actual spring rate to them, maybe a teeny tiny bit. And then these are the guides that go in between the main spring and the helper spring. So that's what it will look like once we get it onto the shock. So what we'll do here first is get the front shocks off the car, get the camber plates off of there, and I've got to machine this little spacer or little bushing. I gotta machine that shoulder off of it. Hopefully that'll focus. So that ridge there, I actually need to cut that off of these spacers so we can use them. Probably get my Dremel out and see if the cutting wheel will take that off. Not quite sure what is going to get it off just yet, but we'll figure it out. And once we have that done, we can get the camber plates onto the MCS shocks down here and then get them into the car, and then we'll do the back shocks next. Alright guys, removing the front shocks is pretty straightforward. There's only, 2, 4, 7 total bolts or Allen bolts that you need to remove. The two big ones are the ones that attach the lower shock body here. Those are 19 millimeter bolts. You've got your little, I think 10 or 12 millimeter bolt holding the brake line on back here, and then whatever bolts you have holding your sway bar end link. So I'm going to use a breaker bar to get these big bolts out first. The last bolts that we'll remove are up on the top where the camber plate attaches. That lower one is a little awkward to get to with the giant breaker bar. We got those two loosened up, we'll get the others here taken care of. Bolt holding your brake line in place is a 12 millimeter. Get your little clips taken off that hold the brake lines in place. Once we have those out of the way, sway bar end link, which can be a bit of a pain. So the sway bar end links are by far the most annoying part about this job, just because it's hard to fit tools in there and it's just time consuming. Not difficult or anything, just takes a while to get them done. And that one won't be able to get out of there until the shock is off, so we'll remove these main bolts and then get to the top. Alright, now that those two main bolts on the lower shock shaft are off, we can move to the 3 top bolts here inside the engine bay. So we'll pop these guys off with a 6 millimeter Allen wrench. Then we can go back underneath the car and then lower the shock out from the bottom. Now all that's left to do, simply remove our large bolts or drop them. That works too. Everything is kind of loose and dangling at this point, so you want to make sure not to let everything go flying out, because it will. Saved it. There goes the end link from the sway bar, that's fine. We can let the brake assembly kind of hang out there, and then we get our shock out. Alright, the shock is off with the camber plate attached. Let's take a quick look here. Again, these are our Race Comp Engineering Tarmac 2 coilover shocks. These things have been awesome. Not gonna lie, fantastic system for the price that you get. What we have to do is get the camber plate off, because obviously we're gonna reuse that. But first I'm gonna jump back under the other side of the car, pull the other one off. We'll do that one in a time lapse to save some time in the video. And it's also quicker for me just to do the work without recording every minute of it. So we'll get that one off, and then we'll start getting them apart, and then we got to modify those spacers, and then we can put together the MCS front suspension. Alright, with both shocks off the car now, I'm actually going to disassemble the one shock on the bench here and then reassemble one of the MCS shocks. And then, like always, you guys know I like to weigh things. We're going to see how much lighter the MCS setup is compared to the Tarmac 2, even though the MCS has the reservoir. It's a different style shock design. It's a shorter shock body, and when I was lifting them up earlier, they feel much lighter. So we're going to get them all together, weigh them up, and see if there's actually any true weight savings going to the MCS setup. So getting the camber plate off of the shock just requires removing this top nut here. Now you want to be careful you don't clamp down this section of the shock on the Tarmac 2s. You can use a wrench or a crescent wrench. I don't have one that fits currently, but since these things aren't torqued down, really only you have to just kind of whack them with the wrench to get them to tighten down. You can use the same approach when taking them off. So you just get your wrench on there, give it a swift kick, and that loosened it up. Like I said, they're not torqued. You're not supposed to torque them. So they usually go off and on pretty easily. Alright, so the camber plate is now off of the shock, and I just remembered that I forgot to measure my stupid ride height on my car before I took everything off. So that's going to make setting the ride height just a little more time consuming. It would have been nice to see where I was set. I'm pretty sure I remember I've got it written down somewhere, but I should have done that before I brought the car off of the ground, so I had a note of it. But let's take a look at these camber plates here. So this is the bottom side. This is that bearing based spring perch I was talking about in my video last week. And then here is the special bushing which goes into the bearing in the camber plate, the spherical bearing there. This has to fit in the perch like so. So this is the one that is specific to the Tarmac 2s, and then my one that is specific to the MCS, as you can see, fits in there, and then this goes into the camber plate. The only difference on the MCS is we have to have that little spacer down in here because the shock shafts are really long on the MCS, these guys here, versus the Tarmac 2s, whereas you can see they're much shorter than the MCS there. So now we've got to go and get this spacer fixed up so that it fits properly. This is probably the least fun part of this job. I didn't have to do that with the Tarmac 2s, but sometimes you got to improvise and make solutions work, and then this is one of those cases. Alright, so that worked out pretty good, just using a little cutting disc on the Dremel here. We got that shoulder knocked off of the spacer there. I think what I'll do is get another grinding wheel and kind of smooth it out a little bit more, and then take care of the other one. Alright, 2 spacers complete for the MCS front shocks. That wasn't bad at all. These came out really good. The Dremel cutting wheel made quick work of them. Here's the other one, nothing too special. Focus. Focus. I think it focused. Anyways, you guys get the idea. That should allow us to get the front shocks put together. So what we're going to do is pull out an MCS shock, move the springs over with the spacers, the perch, and the rest of the camber plate assembly, get that thing together, and then we're going to weigh these 2 front shocks. We have the MCS shock laid out on the table. I've got my spring assortment here. I kind of laid out everything in the order that it goes on the shock. So you've got your main spring. Make sure I've got my Swift 5K spring, the correct one for the front. So we've got the spring, this guy here, which goes between our helper spring and our main spring. Got my little spacer that we just made, the spring perch, and the spring perch bushing. Then we'll throw, actually I forgot the camber plate, we'll throw the camber plate there, and then the top nut, which goes on last, which ties everything together. Alright, so we got the camber plate installed. That's a little bit tricky, obviously, because you have to push down on the camber plate to compress the little helper spring in order to get the top nut threaded all the way down. It helps if you soften the suspension or the shock collar, just loosen this thing till it's nice and soft up here. And then MCS suspension says once you get the nut tight, you just take your wrench, again like when we took it off, so it's already tight there, and give it a quick whack. And that's all there is to it to get the top nut tightened down. Alright, so with that first shock assembled, before we go and weigh them, I kind of wanted to show you how this spacer, spring perch, and spring perch bushing all goes together in a little bit more detail. Now, on my Racecomp Engineering suspension, these guys down here, when you have the Racing camber plates, the nice camber plates, everything is plug and play. The spring perch bushing that they provide for the Tarmac 2s fits without a hitch. With the MCS, of course, like I mentioned, we had to use that little spacer for everything to fit right, so I'll show you how it all goes together. So here's the assembled shock. You can kind of see down in there underneath the spring perch is where our little spacer lives. And on top of the spacer is the spring perch bushing, which fits into the camber plate, kind of like we showed you earlier. Now here on the unassembled shock, this is what it looks like on the underside. You've got your spacer, which goes down over the shock shaft, butts up against the shoulder on the shaft, and then your spring perch bushing, this guy here, goes down on top of that spacer, and then that spring perch goes underneath the bushing, which is where this shoulder right here fits. Once that's down, you kind of have to visualize having your spring perch on there, obviously. The camber plate then goes over the top of that spring perch bushing. It fits onto that shoulder there. So with the MCS, it's just one little modification you have to make to that spacer. Those spacers do come in the MCS kit. They're intended to be used with the stock top hats or the stock camber plates. They're not even camber plates, whatever you want to call them, the stock top mounts for the front suspension. But since we have aftermarket Racing camber plates, you have to do that little tiny modification for the MCS suspension. Alright, so we have my hanging scale. We're going to try this with the Tarmac 2 shock first here. So we got 12.0, zero it out. 12.2 on that one. And 12.0 again, so right around 12 pounds. We'll get the MCS suspension hooked up here. Alright, we'll give the MCS a couple weigh-ins here. You can see I taped up the reservoir to the shock. We'll see how that works out. So we got 12.6 on the first one. 11.8, 12.0. Wonder if that first one was just a miss weigh-in. We'll try it again. And 12.4. For some reason I can't get a consistent weigh-in with this guy. 11.6 again, so I don't know, we'll say again right around 12 pounds, maybe 12 and a half pounds, so not actually lighter like I had thought than the Tarmac 2 suspension. One more thing I'm going to do before we start on the second shock and then install these back in the car, since I forgot to measure my ride height, I'm actually going to take the old shock, the Tarmac 2, and try to set the ride height as close as I can just by setting the ride height adjusters at the same length that they are with the Tarmac 2. So try to make this length from here to the top of the camber plate the same on the MCS shock. That will get us close enough to the ride height that we need, and then we can fine tune it once everything's in the car. Alright, we now have both front shocks put together. Now I don't know about you guys, but these things are freaking beautiful. Am I the only one that digs suspension like this? Check these things out. Alright, so next step in the process, obviously putting these things back in the car. We're going to bolt them up. Also bolt up my new Racer X Fab end links that go on the sway bar. Then we'll be ready to get started on the rear shocks. Now that we have both of the front shocks installed, we have to figure out where we're going to route the reservoirs into the engine bay so we can mount them on the strut tower bar. So what I'm thinking is we'll take the reservoir and stick it up here somewhere through where the brake line goes. This plastic will pull away here. Then you'll probably route it up into that area, which will come out in the engine bay down here somewhere, and then we can run it up and mount it onto our strut tower brace there. We're gonna have to figure that out and do some test fitting to see how it's gonna work out. So we'll go ahead and first start by taking off the various clips in here. I think because on this side of the car in the engine bay above the fender well here sits the fuse box, we might have to run the hose further up. Not quite sure, we'll have to see once we get this thing opened up here. So yeah, it looks like we'll have to fish it. You can't really see it in the camera, but in front of the airbox in that direction, we should be able to fish the reservoir up in there. I can see it in the engine bay, so that's good. I think we got it. I'll switch into the engine bay view to show you guys. So here's where we came through the wheel well, right down in here. You can just pull the reservoir up and through. So I think that should work okay for this side. I might loosely zip tie it down where the brake line is right in here. Just put a loose zip tie to kind of keep the tube up there and out of the way. We'll get it all put together here and then show you what it looks like. So after playing around with the routing of the hoses a little bit, I came up with a little bit different solution. Same orientation, we just routed the hose for the reservoir around the brake line. I actually jacked up the suspension unit so that it's in ride height orientation, give me a better idea of where the hose goes when the car will be on the ground. So let's take a look at what we have. And as we mentioned, in this viewpoint you can now see how the reservoir tube goes around the brake line and then into the engine bay underneath the fender liner. Then the hose comes up into the engine bay in the same way, and I routed the passenger side as well, so we'll show you what that looks like. So next up, what we're going to do is actually secure those MCS reservoirs to the strut tower bars that are on the engine bay of the car. Now we'll use these little mounting kits that I got from MCS, which are made specifically to mount your reservoirs to a strut tower bar or something similar. We'll show you what one of the reservoirs looks like when it is mounted up here. Pretty straightforward. It's a little difficult to get the zip ties tightened up in there. That's about the only annoying part as the light comes in. As you can see how these guys line up underneath there. Basically one zip tie goes over the little yellow mount, and then another zip tie wraps up over around the reservoir itself. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side real quick off camera and then finally get started on the rear shocks, and then hopefully we can get this thing down on the ground and maybe do a little test drive. I don't know if I'll have enough light, but we're gonna try to get it done today before it gets too dark. Yes, the front is finally complete. It's looking good. I'm pretty happy with how those mounts worked out for the reservoirs and everything else for that matter. Let's move on to the back. I'm going to try to knock this out pretty quick. I'll show you what bolts we have to remove, what makes it the easiest to get those rear shocks out. Then I'm just going to throw in the time lapse and knock it out real quick, and then we'll show you the rear shock assembly for the MCS suspension. So the way that I like to remove the rear shocks is by actually dropping the whole rear lower control arm, starting with that inboard bolt there that is right next to the differential. Then we also remove the sway bar bolts and then the shock bolt. This way everything all falls out. You don't remove any of the eccentric bolts on the end that actually affect the alignment, and then the shock just drops out of the bottom without having to worry about stretching the lower control arm. Okay, rear shocks are out of the car. We'll show you the new MCS shock setup next to the old Racecomp Tarmac 2. They're a little bit different, and we'll show you how the whole assembly goes together for MCS. Here's our Tarmac 2, of course, using the stock rear top mount, which is this guy here, that unit. Our MCS will be a little bit different. We've got our spring assembly, the spring divider, the helper spring, a little spring top hat which goes onto the bottom of the camber plates, or I'm sorry, the rear shock mount that is, and then the bushings on either side of the shock mount, which are kind of like the camber plates in the front. It fits into the little spherical bearing right down there. And then you have the top nuts, of course, that secure everything into place. So we're going to go ahead and get started putting this shock together. Once we get it done, we'll compare it again with the Tarmac, then we can get it into the car. So the shock went together pretty simple. We're going to go ahead and tighten down the top nuts. Again, like the MCS instructions say, we're just going to kind of give it a whack with the wrench here, get it hand tight, and give it a firm smack. Take our second top nut. This one I'm actually going to put a little bit of Loctite on to keep everything in place. Go ahead and thread that guy on, tighten it down. Pretty much all there is to it. Now looking at these rear shocks side to side, there's quite a bit of difference. Let's take a little bit closer look of the two shocks right next to each other. You can see the MCS shock has a shorter overall shock body. There's about another inch or so maybe of shock body, or inch or so less I should say, and you have a lot longer shock shaft using the aftermarket rear top hat versus the OEM thing, which is gigantic. and whatever that is, maybe 4 inches of travel versus, you know, 5 or so inches on the MCS. And when I pick these ones up, the Tarmac 2s are heavy. The MCS are quite a bit lighter. I'm not going to throw them on the scale, since when I weighed them the first time on the front shocks, they were still pretty close in overall weight with the reservoir, but they do feel a bit lighter. That might be due to the larger top hat on the Tarmac 2s, that stock top hat, which of course we're not using on the MCS. So let's go ahead, I'll get the other shock put together and then we'll get them into the car. Okay, we have the rear shocks installed on the car. That's the good news. The bad news is I'm running out of light and I want to get this done before it gets too late so I can edit it and have it out by the beginning of the week. I have a busy work week and evenings after work, so I really want to get this done and out to you guys. The only thing left, and I'll give you a quick view of what we've got here so far. So as you can see, the rear shock is installed. Everything's good, not torqued down quite yet. But what I have to do is run the remote reservoirs behind the bumper and up into the trunk, and that's going to be a little time consuming. I've got to move away some of these plastic panels and get them stuffed up in there. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm not really going to film much of it. I'll show you the finished product. So I'm going to get started on that. We'll flip over the video here in just a second and show you what it looks like when it's all done. So what we are able to do is show you a little slideshow of the installation of the rear shock reservoirs. So what we have here is the rear bumper. We've taken off the plastic pieces on the underside. This is where we're going to fish the reservoir up into the bumper and through a little air vent hole that goes into the trunk. This is just another photo of the reservoir getting fitted up into the bumper. Here's where we can see the reservoir coming into the trunk area. That little square hole is actually the vent in the trunk, which is usually covered by a black vent cover. And just another view of the reservoir peeking its way into the trunk. In the next slide, we'll see a closer view again of that vent hole in the back there where you can see the hose coming through. Now this is actually the little vent cover that fits into that hole, and what we have to do is cut a little notch out on the right side of it. You can see there where I cut part of it away. This is so we can fit the tube from the reservoir through that little slot and still maintain that air vent cover inside the trunk. Now here's what the line looks like from the underside as it's been routed into the trunk. You can see we have good tire clearance. The next piece we're taking a look at here is this plastic part that fits on the underside of the bumper. On that inside section, we cut a little hole in that particular part, and you can see it mounted up in the left there, back in its place in the bumper, and the hole where the reservoir hose goes through, which then fits up into the trunk. And here is a short video of the completed product. You can see the reservoir line going to the shock body down on the bottom there, and then coming into the trunk again. I put the remaining pieces back into the trunk, and as you can see, I just zip tied the reservoir to the interior carpet there, and that held it good and in place. Alright everybody, I think we are done for today, about as done as we're gonna get. The whole MCS suspension package is installed both front and rear with the Racer X fabrication end links that I also put on the car. Obviously I have a lot of work to do still. It's still up on the Quick Jack. I gotta get the wheels and tires back on. I gotta get the car on the ground and then work on the ride height and get it close enough so that I can drive it to the race shop for the final alignment, corner balance, and ride height settings here later in the week. So thanks again everybody for watching. I really appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to MCS Suspension. They've been a huge help supporting the Project BRZ, as well as Counterspace Garage, helping us with the spring setup on the car and more in the future from those guys. I also want to thank my buddies at Pegasus Auto Racing for setting us up with the helper springs and the spring dividers that I needed at the last minute to get everything installed. And of course, some good friends of mine that helped out with getting everything installed properly. Without them, it would have taken me a lot longer to get this project done. So stay tuned for more coming up real quick. Like I said, I'm gonna get the car into the race shop for the corner balancing and alignment. I have an autocross event this coming Saturday, so that will be the first time we get to test out the new MCS suspension. So I'm really looking forward to that. And like always, if you guys have any thoughts or comments, please leave them down below. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. It helps us out a ton. Share with your friends, all of that good stuff. And remember to stay fast out there. I'm checking out. We'll talk to you all next time.